Colonel Lincoln Ferris here with my trusty PIPOC. Let's talk about how one woman managed to affect the history of two countries for almost 1,000 years and how that matters to civil affairs. Remember, my thoughts, not DOD, not USCAPOC, not SWIC, and there are probably even a few historians that might disagree as well. Let's talk about how one marriage can affect two countries in almost 1,000 years of history. Remember, I'm going to be going over a lot of topics fairly quickly, not in depth. Starts off with this person, Eleanor of Aquitaine, Queen Consort of France from 1137 to 1152, and then the Queen Consort of England from 1154 to 1189. How do we get here? Well, kind of simple. William of Normandy crosses the English Channel and killed Harold, last king of the Anglo-Saxons, in 1066 at the Battle of Hastings. By 1087, he had taken over most of England and had the northern part of France. And of course, what language did he speak? He spoke a version of French. So the English are now speaking French for court functions, for deeds, parliament. And this went on for about 300 years. 1362 is when they finally got rid of that. But even so, you still had lingering traces. In 1417, the last deed was written in French in England. And it wasn't until 1731 that they stopped using French law for terms like courts of oyez and terminer, and instead went over to common law. So a lot of connection between England and France. Here you go. This is in 1087, all the lands that William controlled. Up towards Scotland, didn't get Wales just yet, and Normandy there. Eleanor of Aquitaine. In 1137, her father dies, and she inherits Aquitaine, Gascony, Poitou, and more. She is the most eligible and richest woman in all of Europe. As Monty Python would say, she had huge tracts of land. And this is what Eleanor's holdings were. The County of Poitou, the Duchy of Aquitaine, the Duchy of Gascony, the County of Périgord, the County of Limoges, the Vicomté of Limoges, and the County of Auvergne. And yes, I probably butchered those names. Like a lot of people who have a lot of wealth, Eleanor had a lot of suitors. And the King of France said, hey, check out my son, Louis VII. He's the Crown Prince of France. He's cool. Eleanor decided to marry him, and within a year the king had died. Louis VII is king, and she is now the Queen of France. However, there's trouble in paradise. She and the king go to Jerusalem for the Second Crusade, and they're having constant clashes between her people and his. And mostly it boils down to she's had two children, both daughters, but no sons. And in France, at that time, you had to have a son to take over. 15 years of marriage, no male heir. That's what led to the breakup more than anything else. They did use the excuse that they were first cousins once removed, and that was a fourth degree of consanguinity to convince the Pope to annul the marriage. As the marriage was dissolved, the daughter stayed with the king, but Eleanor retained her lands. She goes and meets up with her third cousin, Henry Plantagenet, who's the Count of Anjou and the Duke of Normandy, and the Crown Prince of England. They get married, not even 2 months after her marriage is dissolved. And then in 1154, Henry takes over, becoming the King of England. And she bears the English king 5 sons. You can see where some people might have a little bit of hurt feelings over this. This is what it looks like in France. The English basically control half of it. So not only did Eleanor not produce a son for France, she divorced the king, annulled, the marriage was annulled her marriage, and then went and married this guy from across the English Channel, taking half of France with her. And then she starts producing male heirs. The French have no desire and no willingness to allow half of France be English. Squabbles lead to the Anglo-French War, where the French win and they take the county of Anjou, Poitou, and the Duchy of Brittany, which basically cut the British holdings in half, the northern part of Normandy and the southern part of Aquitaine. Worse, the French were able to demand and receive £60,000 in reparations. This about bankrupted England, which led the nobility to be rather upset with the king, King John. So they met him at a place called Runnymede, where they said, hey, sign this Magna Carta or else. John did, but he refused to abide by it, which led to the First Barons' War, English Civil War. Louis, the Prince of France, said, hey, I bet you I can take all of England. So he invades. The barons back him. And everything is going swimmingly for Louis of France till John dies. And the barons say, you know what? We'd rather have his kid, Henry III, because he's all 9 years old, running the country than some French guy. So Louis's ambitions are thwarted for now. Then we have the Santiago War, which again, another French victory, another loss of territory for England. Then the War of St. Sardos, where England lost most of Aquitaine. And then finally the 100 Years' War from 1337 to 1453, where France more or less is French, for the most part. A small portion of French territory remains in English hands, that's Calais, until about 1558. So, after all that fighting over French land, to include an invasion by Prince Louis into England during the First Barons' War, pretty much all of France is French and all of England is English. But that doesn't stop the fighting, because now they get to fight over colonies. Despite the fact that English kings would claim title to French lands until the 1800s, there was really no way it was going to happen. Now in 1815, Napoleon loses at Waterloo, and the British Empire has become the dominant power in the world. And France and England still dislike each other. All right, so let's wrap it up. What is the moral of this story? One marriage in 1152 locked two major powers, France and England, into 800 years of conflict, both on each other's territories and throughout the world. And it still has effects that we feel to this day. That's why civil affairs, you have to study history. You have to know the culture, because if you don't know why there's fighting, how are you going to be effective in helping the commander ameliorate the problems of civilians on the battlefield? All right, there you have it. From about 1066 to the end of the French-Indian War in 1763, the French beat the British. Afterwards, the British beat the French, ended up becoming the dominant world power. But as you can see, there was a lot of rivalry between the two groups. Really, with the marriage of Eleanor of Aquitaine, is when things got to a head. And again, these are things that still impact us today. So if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me, either by email or through links below. As always, a book recommendation: Civil Military Operations in the New World by John T. Fishel. It covers Panama to Somalia. And it's handy to have an understanding of the history, because you can take from history ways they solved problems and use that for current and future operations. So if you take that and you understand how things worked and you understand how things are working today, you're in a better position to help the commander meet the commander's intent.